First, our top story heads to the air cargo industry as Flexport catches some headlines as well as a White House shout-out for pushing sustainable aviation fuel. Our air cargo editor, Eric Kulisch, joins us now to talk about it. Eric, this is a very interesting subject. We talked about sustainable fuels, certainly on the ocean side with IMO 2020 and 2022, and now all of a sudden we get this new great push here by the airline industry in a very unique way to try and get sustainable airline fuels out into the mainstream.
Well, Bill, yeah, it's kind of interesting in the sense that it's unique, but it's kind of not that unique. I mean, there's been a push to get sustainable aviation fuel production ramped up in the last few years. It's such a tiny portion, less than 1% of the total jet fuel compared to jet fuel, conventional jet fuel consumed by airlines. And there's been a push for governments and for energy producers to make more of it because the demand is increasing, and then hopefully that would bring down the price because sustainable aviation fuel is about at least three or four times more expensive. So there's been a lot of initiatives to forward purchasing agreements of about $45 billion for airlines to purchase SAF when it becomes available from companies. And so what we had this week, and by the way, the airline industry and the International Civil Aviation Organization have set a 2050, target for becoming net zero carbon neutral. So that's kind of the goal. But what we had a couple of weeks ago during the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum in San Francisco, that's the big gathering of Asia Pacific nations hosted by the U.S. and President Biden was there, and they announced about $50 billion worth of U.S. businesses investing in that region. And among those companies mentioned was Flexport, San Francisco-based third-party logistics provider, for their sustainable aviation fuel initiative, which they just announced a couple of weeks prior. And so that was kind of interesting. Biden also mentioned them in addition to the fact sheet from the White House. President Biden mentioned Flexport in the speech. So the Flexport programs, got some publicity, but it really isn't anything new compared to what a lot of logistics companies have already been doing for a long time.
And so, Eric, as you mentioned, Flexport is that 3PL space. They do a lot of freight forwarding, particularly in the air cargo space. But they're a very, very small fish in a very, very big air cargo pond. And with that 1% of people who are focusing on this sustainable jet fuel alternative, there's a lot of work to do before we get that even air cargo space specifically into that kind of net zero space. How many other people are starting to buy into this? And is it a truly viable option? And do we maybe look at starting it with the freight forwarders, with those very, very bottom tier people, and then building up the momentum as we go deeper into the industry?
Well, the sustainable aviation fuel, like I said, the production isn't there yet. So, but you've had a lot of initiatives to kind of create that demand, because the more demand you have, then there's, investors are more willing to build the production and the distribution infrastructure to get it to airports. So, you've had a lot of logistics companies and, forwarders basically do these agreements with airlines, basically saying they would pay a premium if an airline, let's say Lufthansa Cargo, they, for instance, have fly these charter flights from Frankfurt to Shanghai with sustainable aviation fuel. Some of the big shippers like Kuehne Nagel and DB Schenker have agreed to participate, so they pay a portion of those extra costs that gap that costs to buy the SAF fuel. So there's a lot of that going on. But, there's also the challenge that, you can't, there's such limited availability that you can't always target your flight that you're flying on. So the Flexport program and ones by Kuehne Nagel and some others involves what's called a book and claim process. It's a virtual process where you say, I'll buy X amount of SAF but it could be for any flight with any airline anywhere in the world, not necessarily the one your shipment's flying for. And then you get a credit for that amount of carbon saved for your kind of carbon footprint metrics as a shipper. So that's the process that's Flexport's doing. They're not really injecting any, SAF of their own into the network.
Eric, it seems like this has gotten, as I got a chance to read the article, this has got a lot of appreciation and motivation behind it. Just as you mentioned, some of the other players that are into this, as well as the process in terms of getting, or at least buying the fuel, if you're not necessarily using it. What do you think? You get a sense from people in the industry as to what their overall idea about this is, including, obviously in other areas, they're not real big on going into sustainable fuels, whatever that may be, but this one seems to have a little bit more motivation behind it.
I mean, the airline industry realizes there's, they're one of the more carbon intensive industry sectors in the world, especially in transportation. And there's a clear realization they've got to clean that up, or public support won't be there. But it's very difficult. Sustainable aviation fuel is considered a bridge fuel to really what you want to get to, which is hydrogen power or electric power, which is a little difficult for large and heavy aircraft. But that's the goal, and so. It might be 10 or 15 years before we even see a hydrogen aircraft flights, and there's some small electric vehicle flights now, but what will it take to get there? So, we're decades away from those technologies becoming kind of reaching any kind of critical mass, and SAF is kind of seen as a way to get there. But, we're still at least a decade away, or 2030 maybe, before we see some maybe, more large enough quantities of SAF to begin to make a dent. So, everybody's trying to move quickly there. There actually was a UN conference last week where nations agreed to try and get to 5% SAF usage, or total fuel usage being SAF by 2030.
And so some of those motivations, of course, come in the form of grants or in government support, whether that's on the state or a federal level. We all know that, California is very, very big on reducing those emissions, and the Biden administration has that 2050 net zero goal for us. Do we see any types of subsidies or any type of government programs coming down the pipeline that really encourage this transition, maybe for a specific carrier or from these freight forwarders, that would give a little bit more monetary support if they make the decision to invest more in their SAF?
Yeah, that's a good question. In Europe, the European Commission has kind of mandated like these gradual increases of SAF usage, I think starting in 2025, where each year airlines have to inch up how much they use. The industry doesn't really like that. It feels like it's a little too much of a stick approach, and there might not be enough SAF available, or, people might travel more by road, and that's, or some other way that's less carbon, beneficial for short haul. So there's that going on. In the U.S., there's some incentive programs I believe in the Inflation Reduction Act, and some other incentives to try and gin up investment and give some grants to help, these energy producers develop and install the, production base using biofuels or other types of, feedstock for the sustainable aviation fuel.
Obviously, we've seen the want and the desire to use it, but you also, as you well mentioned, the infrastructure is not there. The production certainly is not there. Any initiatives along those lines to try and get those things off the ground?
A lot of, I don't know any specifics. I know Shell, Neste, a lot of these energy companies are working hard on this. United Airlines has a venture capital fund that they've started, and some other airlines and companies have pitched in to, spread some money to startup companies in this area so they can, get some of their technology up to commercial scale. So we'll just have to see, how those develop. But the interest is there. It's just a matter of financing, technology development, and demand.
All right, Eric, and it's going to be interesting to watch and see how these continue to change in the future. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Anytime.